another escalation in Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. For the first time in the 400-plus days since the invasion began, civilian areas of Moscow may have been targeted. This plume of smoke is the apparent aftermath of Russia shooting down a drone, one of 8 that their Ministry of Defense says was stopped over the capital.
Посмотри, брат. Ты видишь? Вот Рома.
So far, no deaths have been reported, though drone debris has damaged several buildings there. Russia is blaming Ukraine, and its Interior Ministry issued arrest warrants for 2 senior Ukrainian commanders. But an advisor for Ukraine's president issued this denial, saying, quote, "We enjoy watching and predicting an increase in attacks, but of course, we have nothing to do directly with it." In the meantime, Ukraine's capital has been bombarded for days, the 17th aerial assault by Russia this month alone. Let's take you now live to Kyiv and CNN's Fred Pleiken. And Fred, you were learning that Vladimir Putin has now responded to these alleged Ukrainian drone attacks.
Hi there, Boris. Well, he certainly has, and he also points the finger of blame at Ukraine as well. One of the other things that was very interesting about that alleged attack that happened early in the morning hours is the Russians were very quick to point out that these were actually substantial unmanned aerial vehicles that made their way towards the Russian capital. They say these were fixed-wing aircraft and not some sort of octocopter that's a lot smaller than that. They said of the 8 that they took down, 3 of them were taken down using electronic measures, but they also said that they actually had to activate their air defenses and use missiles to shoot down the 5 others. So certainly this was a substantial attack, as the Russians put it, on Moscow. Absolutely unprecedented since the Russians started their full-on invasion of Ukraine. And you are absolutely right. Vladimir Putin, seemingly quite angry, pointed the finger of blame squarely at Kyiv. Here's what he said.
Kyiv chose the path of intimidation of Russian citizens and attacks on residential buildings. It is a clear sign of terrorist activity. The Moscow air defense system worked satisfactorily. However, there is still work to be done to make it better.
So as you've already noted, Boris, the Ukrainians issuing a denial earlier today, coming in the form of an advisor to the presidential administration here in Kyiv, actually pretty early on in the game, where they did say that they were happy that these drone attack had happened, but they also said they didn't have any direct involvement in it. Nevertheless, as you can imagine, the capital of Kyiv here, of course, bracing for possible further attacks. And, you know, this comes after what was really a very difficult night here in the Ukrainian capital. Having witnessed this overnight, there were waves of attacks by those Iranian-made Shahed drones that the Russians have been sending here for the past couple of months. And it really was over the course of several hours that Ukrainian air defenses were firing in the air. And we were hearing them firing in the air and hearing explosions of those unmanned aerial vehicles being hit and falling to the ground. There was one woman who was killed in a large residential building. We were on site there just a couple of hours ago, and there was substantial damage to that building. And again, the Ukrainians, while saying they had nothing to do with those attacks on Moscow, certainly bracing for what could be even worse to come. Boris?
Yeah, again, the 17th attack focused on Kyiv by Russia just this month. Fred Pleiken from Ukraine, thank you so much. And Jim, we should note that these drone attacks in Moscow, some of them focused on one of the most elite areas of the capital city, not far from Vladimir Putin's residences.
Elite and also civilian, and that raises some important questions. We're joined now by retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Good to have you on. Let's look at some of these attacks recently, because one phenomenon we're seeing are multiple attacks in recent days and weeks inside, well, Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine down here, but also inside Russia itself. Kursk, Volgograd, close to the border, but also in Moscow, we have that strike on the Kremlin recently, which the U.S. says low confidence assessment was probably the Ukrainians. Now we have these drones here. On the issue of civilian targets, if that was indeed the intentional target here, what does that mean for Ukraine's war? I mean, certainly Russia has come under enormous criticism for directly and repeatedly targeting civilians in Ukraine.
Well, certainly, Jim, if the Ukrainians are targeting civilians deliberately, that makes it a whole other ballgame, and that would be a very bad move on Ukraine's part. Because right now what they're enjoying is a lot of support from the West, because they are following, basically, or at least have until this point, followed the rules of war, the rules of armed conflict. And that becomes really important for Ukraine's war effort. They cannot afford to target civilians, and they shouldn't do so by mistake either.
Let's have a look. We know that the Ukrainians have been using drones prior in this conflict on military targets, including some in pretty old one here going back to the 70s. I mean, you know, a far cry from what we're seeing now, smaller, more mobile kinds of things. Could that lead, if this was Ukraine and if the civilian areas were the deliberate target, could that lead to disagreements with the U.S. And NATO partners?
So one of the key things that the Ukrainians have done is they've used weapons like this Tu-141 drone, which is based, like you said, on a Soviet model that they've had for many, many years. The idea here is that they are using their own systems to target Russia.
Right.
They are not using Western systems, they are not using US systems, and they're doing that deliberately because the US has very specifically told them not to use Western systems.
Notably, they used a Ukrainian manufactured missile to strike the Russian Moskva, flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, going back to the early stages of the war. But before we go, let's look back again at all these sites that have taken hits by Ukrainian forces in recent days, this just in the last 24 hours here. Given the anticipation of a Ukrainian ground offensive to take back some of this Russian-controlled territory down here, if you were planning this attack, might you do this to create some fear, uncertainty on the other side prior?
Absolutely, and the reason for that is, you know, if your main target area is all of this down here, then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're keeping people guessing, that you could also potentially attack in this area, and especially right here in Belgorod, because that area is not only close to Ukraine, but it is a major staging area for the Russians. And if they attack there, that would be a legitimate target for the Ukrainians to attack, in addition to all of these areas right here.
I remember in the first day of the invasion watching Russian tanks. We had our Fred Pleitkin up there on the border watching them drive across the border into Ukraine for the war. Cedric Layton, thanks so much.